These movies go really well together. They both show us America torn apart by internal dissent, as seen through the eyes of journalists covering the events. They give us the veteran newsman to offer clarity and an anchor to the good old days in contrast to the more reckless younger generation. They both show us a president that isn't up to the job as the country violently collapses around him.
What are you telling me?
But even more striking are the ways they differ. Civil War puts us with war correspondents on the ground, trying to get from New York City to DC on their own as they chase the story. It's watching the conflict with blinders on. One of the loudest criticisms of the film has been that it doesn't tell us why the war started. We don't know what the grievances are. How are California and Texas on the same side? Why is the president in his third term, and why is he so hated? But those things aren't what this story is about. It's about these people who see themselves as objective witnesses to events as they watch their country implode, gradually coming to grips with the reality that objective detachment isn't possible. They're active participants in the events. It's a story about consequences more than causes. Given the polarization of the time in which the film was made, with America arguably in the ideological stage of civil war where distinct sides with distinctly separate values no longer believe the other is arguing in good faith and view the conflict as existential, the film does a remarkably good job of not identifying either side of its war clearly with current factions. So let's briefly look at the situation here and try to figure it out. Texas and California are allied, so it's not a straight-up red state, blue state fight. The president looks a little Trumpy, but his opening speech is uncertain, a little halting, almost Biden-esque at some points.
Some are already calling it the greatest victory in the history of mankind.
He's a generic American president figure that would work in any film. All of the major armies are depicted as racially integrated forces, so the tired white supremacist trope isn't the fault line. Even the film's Boogaloo Boys get the same treatment. It's emphatically not a war about identity politics. The only place that Civil War seems to drop the ball on that is in its most iconic scene.
What kind of American are you?
A lot of people read this as some white guys doing ethnic cleansing, which is one possible interpretation. This scene could have been handled better to match the careful ambiguity of the rest of the film, but there's still a lot of gray here if we really dissect the scene, which I think makes it a lot more interesting than it seems at first glance. So, most obviously, Red Glasses guy shoots a journalist because he was born in China.
I'm from Hong Kong.
Oh, China.
He doesn't see him as American. It's also a diverse pile of bodies in that mass grave, suggesting the dispute is more about some kind of ideological distinction more than ethnicity. We don't know why they were killed. We don't know who these guys are, whether they're even part of any of the belligerents' armies, perhaps deliberately signaled by the filmmakers in this moment.
Florida.
Florida.
Florida is part of a somewhat ambiguous power block in this story, against the federal government, but distinct from the Western forces that seem to be the central threat. We don't know exactly what the relationship is, and it seems that Red Eyes isn't sure either. He seems almost as in the dark as we are. Both sides in this war wear the same uniforms and use the same equipment. These guys wear US Army uniforms, and the location is deep within the territory of the Loyalist states. But these men have no rank tabs or name tapes on their uniforms. The only unit insignia they display is this, which doesn't show up at any other point in the film. Are these guys some local militia? Does the federal government have Einsatzgruppen doing the nasty work of rooting out subversives among the populace? We don't know what's going on. We can only make assumptions. The line, "What kind of American are you?" is the heart of the scene. And it applies to everyone in it, including us, the viewers, because no one knows who anyone else is. The lines of us versus them can shift on a whim, and the stakes of misidentification are life and death. This fatal ambiguity is a repeating theme.
They're stuck. We're stuck.
Who do you think they are?
No idea.
For most of the film, it's not so much an American Civil War redux scenario with armies fighting, but a balkanized stew of mutually hostile factions. The Second Civil War goes the other way, making the causes and sides of the conflict very clear. While the journalist perspective is the narrative frame, this one gives us the big picture. Not only does it follow the newsroom itself as all the sources of information flow in, but it also bounces between reporters in the field covering every aspect of the building conflict. There's a news crew on the flight bringing in a bunch of Pakistani orphans. There's a reporter with Governor Farley of Idaho who is blocking the resettlement of those orphans in his state. There's eyes at the White House. We see the president and his cabinet bungle through the crisis. We know the fault lines, the triggers, the major players. And while at the time this played heavily on the Gulf War style of war coverage, cynically playing it up for ratings.
Let me ask you something. Do you want to land at JFK in the middle of the afternoon when nobody is watching and maybe get a 1.2 share? Or do you want to land at JFK prime time in the morning and perhaps garner a 28 share?
Today it plays a bit differently, because when the Second Civil War was made in 1997, news media was still considered to be at least somewhat credible by most of the population. Biases were clearly present, but the average conservative Republican could see something on CNN and generally assume that the broad strokes of the event reported were reasonably accurate, even if vehemently disagreeing with the framing or the conclusions being drawn.
Shut up! Shut up, you little wanker! Shut up!
However,
There were many different sources of information, but the major news networks were reasonably trusted by most of the population. Today, there's really no such thing as credible national media. There are multiple outlets reporting with varying levels of rigor, but there's so much polarization that most of the population lives in their own worlds, consuming their preferred media sources and excluding those they disagree with. The balkanization of media that was really getting underway in the 90s has matured into a bunch of little gardens where people can have their preferred narrative constantly reinforced, and anyone they don't like is a fascist.
It is my constitutional right to do as I see fit.
within
All right,
reason,
you know
you
what? You are a fascist. Do you know that? How
I'm
do
a
you
fascist.
feel about that? Yeah.
That's what you call everybody who doesn't think exactly like you do,
Yeah,
right?
Blaine?
Yeah.
The story of the Second Civil War could have been told as a weighty drama using the same basic structure, but they consciously chose to use mass media as a satirical device. A new Civil War movie made today couldn't show it through a big media lens without framing the entire war as a cynical scam perpetrated on the public, whether that's what they were trying to do or not. There's still immense comedy potential in that, but there's not enough trust in the institution anymore to play it straight. So Civil War scales down, staying at the level of field reporters, characters we can connect with as people more than pieces of a machine, whether media or political. The characters at the heart of that story are trying to be journalists, trying to document events.
Once you start asking yourself those questions, you can't stop. So we don't ask. We record so other people ask.
We see a similar theme in the older film with the character of Vinny, a producer running around the front lines. He'll chase the armies around, wander through war zones. He doesn't worry about anyone's rules, and his efforts to just report on events end up raising the stakes by exposing that the conflict is already bigger than anyone knows.
It is no longer just Idaho against the federal government. Our producer Vince Franco has just sent these images of troops from Montana, North Dakota, and possibly other states that are prepared to fight.
In different ways, both films play with the idea that you can't cover a war objectively if you're on the ground with one side, but you can't understand a war without that on-the-ground perspective. A key piece of both stories is accepting that you can't be completely objective or detached.
We're inside, not outside.
Mel, you just don't get it, do you? It's all outside now. Just get used to it.
And both films drive home the absurd tragedy of it at the end. The 24 film shows us iconic DC monuments blasted apart, and finally American soldiers, because they're all Americans, gunning each other down before posing for photos over the dead president. We wonder what for, and we don't get an answer. We're still arguing about our last Civil War. We don't get to have simple answers to these things. We don't fight about the easy questions. It's the hard ones that get bloody. The 97 film plays up the farce, with the hot war being triggered in large part by marketing.
I'm talking about moving it on to the image level.
And an obvious mistake.
What are you talking about? You told me yourself. And we had to take action before Farley made his cessation speech.
I said succession.
However you look at it, it's absurd. It's tragic. And it's funny. In both cases, we connect with the reporters in the field, risking their lives as participants in battles, even as they think of themselves as neutral observers. Like war correspondents in our own world, they're the filter we see the fighting through. Their choices shape our perceptions. Their values frame the narrative. People ask me all the time if I think we're actually headed for some kind of civil war scenario. I don't know, I doubt it, at least in the sense that most people usually think about it, with armies and flags. But I suppose crazy things can happen. And it's hard to talk about with Americans because we use peculiar terminology. Our Civil War wasn't a civil war at all, it was a separatist movement. The Confederacy was a country with borders, an army, its own currency and postal service. We didn't have a revolution either, that too is a separatist movement. How we label things changes how we think about them. But whether we actually end up with Americans fighting over pieces of a once unified country or we just lumber ahead despising each other, there's layers of messages in these movies.
I'm a reporter. I ain't with anybody. Maybe because too many sacred eggs are getting busted. See, I rode the buses back in the 60s to bring people together. Pretty unfashionable now, isn't it?
That's part of it, but even when you try to bring people together, there's no real neutrality. Everyone either picks a side, gets assigned one by association, or ends up alone and despised by all. But most of all, it's a reminder that war isn't an engine that you can just start and stop at will. It's a fire that once started has to burn itself out, and you can't predict where the winds will blow it. This channel began on this very rock,